Things can change in an instant in this game. On this show, which is Fantasy for Real, my ultimate goal is to prepare as best I can for these changes, but no one can predict these things that are going to happen in this sport. Now, a couple of my recent opening entries have been about Justin Fields. I don't want to make this one too directly about Justin Fields. So I just want to talk about some other situations that have happened in the past few years, looking at startup ADPs of players who haven't exactly lived up to expectations. Now, if you're suffering from the loss of Justin Fields as a starting quarterback, this might help you give a little bit of perspective into the fact that you're not alone. If you've been playing Dynasty for a long time, this might bring up some bad memories, but let's just get into it. In 2022, after Jonathan Taylor, the big running back debate for running back 2 often revolved around Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, and Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams obviously had the big injury. DeAndre Swift's had a big rebound recently. But the big thing there is the name that's missing. This was the point in Christian McCaffrey's career where he had played 10 total games in the previous 2 seasons. And so he was valued pretty much lower than he is right now, despite being 2 years younger. This was also before the 49ers trade. But the real peak of some dynasty mistakes happened in 2019, specifically at the wide receiver and quarterback positions. This was the year that Odell Beckham Jr. was going to the Cleveland Browns and combining with Baker Mayfield to become one of the premium duos in the National Football League. In fact, 2 of the top wide receivers that year were Odell Beckham Jr. and Juju Smith-Schuster. Juju Smith-Schuster, since that year, has not broken through 1,000 yards a single time. He has broken through 800 yards twice in 5 seasons. Michael Thomas was another one of the top wide receivers that year. 2019 gave you one more amazing season and then nothing else. So it was basically like you were drafting a 35-year-old guy in hindsight, right? Not exactly the, exact same thing. I just said hindsight for a reason. We're using hindsight, but it was basically like you were drafting a 35-year-old guy in Michael Thomas. And then at the quarterback position, I already mentioned Baker Mayfield, but after the first 1-2 years of his career, he was considered a top maybe 5 quarterback in Superflex leagues. You know who else was a top 5 quarterback that year? Deshaun Watson. A lot of things going on there. Again, hindsight, not saying you can predict anything, specifically the kind of things that happened with Deshaun Watson. But it's important to note that Baker Mayfield, Deshaun Watson, and they're not the biggest miss of the 2019 startup draft season, because the biggest miss of the 2019 startup draft season was Andrew Luck. Andrew Luck was a player who, based on where most people do their drafts, startup drafts, rookie drafts, Andrew Luck would have retired after everybody drafted because he retired in the preseason. I did a startup draft with friends that year, and somebody did end up taking Andrew Luck in a Superflex 10-team league in either the 2nd or 3rd round because of the fact that, there was a little bit of risk with the injury profile, but no one expected him to retire at like 28, 29 years old or whatever it was. So again, the point here isn't to just take a walk down memory lane. It's important to remember that even as hard as we can try, and the show can try, and the show can spend hours and hours dedicated to research and getting the best possible information, avoiding the big mistakes, or maybe the better thing to say is the big losses in value, is just impossible to truly do, right? So when things like the Justin Fields thing happens, it's just important to remember that mistakes happen all the time. We're never going to be perfect in this game. And sometimes it is impossible to know, because as much as a Bears fan, I could have told you that I'm on the strong contingent and that people are holding on too strongly for Justin Fields. You can go back to all the shows where I talk about selling Justin Fields. I never thought this was going to happen. And so that's an important thing to remember in the context of all this, is that we don't know when these things are going to happen. And so on today's show, on the rest of today's show, I'll go through the latest from the NFL news to try to, take the best information we can, but knowing that it won't be perfect, discuss some of the biggest winners and losers from NFL free agency, and dip into prospect scouting just a little bit with a prospect profile for someone I've only brought up in passing so far, the Troy running back, Kamani Vidal. Because of my recording schedule for this show, the bulk of this show was recorded before the Justin Fields news broke, and that was about on Friday night. But since it didn't really change too much of the discussion on that show, I'm just going to cover that here up front before I get into the core of that show. It's also important to note that the next step for this show as a podcast is to find better ways to separate and transition segments, particularly with maybe noise. So bear with me and do understand that part of this is that some of these shows recently I've had a bit more reaction in with the analysis, which is something that does change things up a bit and is a little bit new for the show as well. And as with all new things with this show, I'm just going to have to kind of figure out how it works. On that note, here is a bit of the news that has broken since I recorded the majority of the show, and then I'll take a short break for a personal ad and get on to the rest of the show, which will include a free agency update and also a discussion on free agency winners and losers. So in terms of things going on in the NFL, the Chicago Bears have officially sent Justin Fields to the Pittsburgh Steelers for a 2025 conditional day 3 pick. They have also stressed publicly, the Steelers, that their desire to start and consider Russell Wilson the starting quarterback is significant. They are not considering this right now an open competition. Russell Wilson is the starter, Justin Fields is the backup. Now, I'm not saying that means it's impossible that somebody can overtake somebody else. Sometimes people go into the season with one idea. They're getting two quarterbacks from two completely different locations. So anything can truly happen when you break it down. But at the end of the day, right now, what you have to expect is for Russell Wilson to be the clear starter and Justin Fields to be the clear backup. Since he is a backup, you also consider the fact that the Pittsburgh Steelers are very unlikely to pick up the 5th-year option. So unless they give an extension to their backup quarterback, Justin Fields is unlikely to have any further commitment to the Pittsburgh Steelers outside of the 2024 season. So Justin Fields, not too much to talk about in terms of the fantasy value. I've talked about him on plenty of shows. I'm guessing there's not too many leagues anymore where there's significant value buys going on for Justin Fields. If you happen to be in a league where you can still find somebody who's willing to grab at the falling knife and, maybe really, really, really doesn't like Russell Wilson, or maybe has Russell Wilson and wants to ensure themselves of that quarterback situation, I can see those opportunities as situations to sell. At the end of the day, Justin Fields is one of those players where you do have to understand that if you're wrong, like significantly wrong, you could pay a lot and you could look bad doing it. But at the end of the day, you also have to understand that Justin Fields is extremely unlikely to be anything at this point. So if you're getting something like a 2nd-round pick for Justin Fields, as much as that has a potential to have more egg on your face, 99 times out of 100, maybe not that many, maybe 89 times out of 100, you're going to end up winning with that 2nd-round pick. And to me, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get assets that help us win. We're trying to have assets that have the highest expected value, and we're trying to have assets that we avoid going to actual zero. So if you can get that 2nd-round pick or anything at all significant for Justin Fields, I do think it's worth exploring for someone like that. But again, I've talked about selling Justin Fields on these shows quite a bit already. The only other thing to bring up is the state of the wide receiver market entering this podcast, meaning the fact that Mike Williams is still a free agent and two major players in terms of Brandon Ayuk and T. Higgins are still considered players who at least might be traded this offseason. In fact, a bit later in the show, in terms of Nico Collins and Tank Dell, I referenced trade rumors with Brandon Ayuk, and to be very clear, to get ahead of it, I don't mean specifically Brandon Ayuk, Houston Texans trade rumors. I mean that Brandon Ayuk exists in the market right now as the number one disruptor to a wide receiver room, because if Brandon Ayuk, no matter where Brandon Ayuk goes, if he goes somewhere, a little bit even more than T. Higgins, these are players who will really disrupt the projected target share of those wide receiver rooms. That's, I think, why for a lot of people, the ideal situation, specifically with the fact that they're not going to be able to get a top 3 wide receiver in the rookie class, is for the Panthers to get either T. Higgins or Brandon Ayuk. Not that it's super realistic. I don't know how realistic it is, but even though they already have Deontay Johnson, getting one of those players helps a lot for Bryce Young. It helps a lot for having volume there, and it doesn't significantly hurt any player except for potentially Deontay Johnson, who for most people is more of a wide receiver 3 or 4 type. And so that's all I have to add, and I'll take a quick break before getting into the majority of my news reactions, some winners and losers, and a Kamani Vidal profile in the main portion of the show. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank everybody for listening to the show, and regardless if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, anywhere else, if you could leave a review for the show, it would mean a lot. Obviously, ideally, it would be a 5-star review, but I'm not going to ask for fake reviews. If you think the show deserves less, just at least the thing that I would ask is to tell me why, so I can try to make sure that I make this show a 5-star show in the future. So that's all I ask. Thank you for joining me, and I'll get into the main portion of the show, which once again was recorded Friday night. It seems pretty standard for most shows to have the news and notes towards the beginning of the show, and I haven't really been doing that very much on this show because this show has been dealing a lot more with prospects and things that haven't really been changing very much in a news and notes way, but as we're going through things and as we're getting into these transactional periods, I think it makes a lot of sense for me to transition a little bit more into this standard method of doing some of these newsworthy things early in the show, especially during this period of time with all the free agency, trades, extension stuff still coming out. So let's get right into some new stuff and some reactions based on that new stuff. So first up, I have Joe Mixon extending for 3 years with the Houston Texans. I didn't get the exact details of the contract before this show, and keep in mind, this show is being recorded Friday night, or at least the main portion of it. But Joe Mixon, the big deal here is that on the previous show, I did my main section on running back rooms, and some of the running back rooms were kind of open in the future or had older running backs or running backs expiring as the main portion of it, and the Houston Texans were in that group. At this stage, the Houston Texans would be in the firmly set rooms alongside, say, the Bears and the Eagles that had a major change and are very set for the upcoming football season and the next couple seasons, most likely. The next newsworthy item I have around the NFL is Keenan Allen going to the Chicago Bears for a 4th-round pick. This is obviously a great thing for the future Chicago Bears quarterback. Most likely, Caleb Williams is a fan of the team. This is a very, very exciting thing. I do think there are some positives and negatives to get into, though, as well. There are going to be a lot of things objectively about Keenan Allen at this stage of his career being as old as he is and moving locations that, typically speaking, don't align with success. In a general capacity, we haven't actually had a wide receiver turn 32 in a season or be 32 or older going into a season and have a top 24 finish since Julian Edelman did it in 2019. Now, last year, Keenan Allen was basically the oldest successful wide receiver in the top 24 since Julian Edelman in 2019, but that also kind of cuts both ways. That's kind of how these age things work. I mean, obviously, he's not getting younger. He's not staying the same age. So on a success note, it's worth noting that he was incredibly successful at an older age than most people have been recently. But it's also worth noting that he's one more year older than that, and there is a reason that players haven't been having a ton of success recently, at this age, at this position. I think your ideal argument, so to speak, would be to say, like, hey, look at Larry Fitzgerald. Larry Fitzgerald was very good for a very long time, and I believe the last 2 or 3 years of his career started at about the age that Keenan Allen is now. And so you really hope that that's what you get, at least for this, first year. He's only on a 1-year deal, at least right now, with the Chicago Bears. And so I think that's what you hope you get with this first year of this deal with Keenan Allen. But there's a lot of risk in a player this old changing locations. I will also say this is probably not a good thing for DJ Moore. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing because it's ultimately probably still going to come down to the statistical projections you're going to put into Caleb Williams or whoever happens to be the Bears starting quarterback. But at the end of the day, the best possible situation to be in, especially if you have a competent starting quarterback or a better than competent starting quarterback when it comes to volume, is to be the guy who is a clear tier better than everybody else around you. And that's what DJ Moore is. As much as, yes, it's important to have pressure taken off of you, there's all kinds of other risks that are associated with having a Keenan Allen on your team that weren't there for DJ Moore last year. So for fantasy, I don't think this is good for Keenan Allen. I don't think this is good for DJ Moore. I do think this is good for Caleb, potentially DeAndre Swift as well. And to transition to the next section here, I do think this is potentially good for wide receiver opportunities with the Los Angeles Chargers, though it is important to note that this is a coaching staff, a coaching brain trust between Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman that has historically underused the wide receiver at every step along the way, both independently of each other and together. Now, to be clear, they worked very well with a late career Michael Crabtree and a late career Anquan Boldin in the 49ers years, but even those peak seasons were in 1,000, 1,100 yard ranges. The vast majority of Greg Roman's career in the NFL has been featured with the top pass catchers on his team having under 1,000 yards. And basically, since he left the 49ers the first time and went to the Bills, Greg Roman hasn't really had a 1,000-yard receiver other than a couple guys that barely broke over it, and then a 1,300-yard Mark Andrews tight end season, which is the best receiving season ever in a Greg Roman offense. And then, it's hard to make these one-to-one comparisons with college, but the number one thing, if you're not a Devy person, developmental, getting these guys before they enter the dynasty circles, if you're not a Devy person, you might not know this, but Michigan is considered where talented wide receiver prospects go to die because of the Jim Harbaugh scheme that they run at Michigan that takes, it runs the ball a lot, it wins them a lot of games, but it's not good for what we're looking for when it comes to developing wide receiver talent. My number one issue with Roman Wilson's profile is that the dude didn't have more than 40 targets until his senior year. Now, I like Roman Wilson, don't get me wrong if you haven't heard my wide receiver rankings, but not having 40 targets until his senior year is crazy. So on that note, I do think there's an opportunity here for a new number one to emerge, and I think in a vacuum, this is a very good thing for the Chargers wide receivers. But for me, not to get too deep into it, but from a market perspective, I would be trying to trade Quentin Johnston and Palmer and Josh Palmer based on this news and try to, sell them for things that I can based on the fact that I don't think these guys have proven enough to be exceptions, and what you're really looking for in a Greg Roman offense is exceptions. I will also say this is more of a general NFL point, but I think a lot of people, especially in the fantasy community, are going to immediately pencil in Malik Neighbors or Rome Odunze at 5. And I do think there's a chance to take Marvin Harrison Jr. if quarterbacks go 1 through 4. But if we're assuming that Marvin Harrison Jr. goes to the Arizona Cardinals at the 4th overall pick, I honestly still think they might take Joe Alt for all the reasons I said earlier. Because we can say all these things about different talents and different players and different caveats that matter for all these things, they really do, but there is no point in any of these two coaches' careers where they have ever shown that wide receivers in their offense individually on a singular player level are really the kind of players that are worth spending top 5 picks on. So maybe they do just love these guys so much that they're an exception, but as much as I do agree fundamentally that they need to add at the wide receiver position. I'm not disagreeing there, but I don't think this is an NFL coaching staff that actually believes that wide receivers, especially highly, highly talented wide receivers, are extremely important to winning at the NFL level. And the combination of scheme and personnel decisions that they've both been associated with for their entire careers spell this out very, very clearly to me. So these players, Johnston, Palmer, in a vacuum, value going up. In my mind, selling going up. We need to sell these players most likely if you can get a really good return on them. Now, Johnston in particular, because of the first round nature, that guy has some potential to get some steam and get you a decent return. So I'm not saying just go out and sell them immediately, but if you can shop around, if you can get a reasonable offer for Quentin Johnston that takes into account that he used to be a first round pick, that takes into account the opportunity for targets that he's currently at this moment situated to get, I think that is an opportunity that I would personally be taking. And then Sam Howell to Seattle. By my pick value charts, this was a a significantly bigger trade than a lot of the other quarterback trades. Now, when I say significantly bigger, it's still a late third round pick, which is not a very significant draft pick. But a late third round pick in total value, when it comes to how it all balanced out, when you do the math in the trade value charts for Sam Howell, a late third round pick in total value, it's important to note that this is a guy who was taken with a 5th round pick 2 years ago. So he's lost 2 years of the rookie contract, and he's being considered a more valuable asset. Again, the most important thing would be if he was paid or considered to be a starting asset. And that clearly did not happen with a late third round pick. So to one extent, they're all the same. But it is important to note that out of all these trades that I'm about to go through, or out of all these transactions that I'm about to go to, only one of them had even close to a significant amount of value in my mind. And it was the Sam Howell trade. Because going to the 70s, even if you're doing it from a pick swap, going from the 90s to the 70s, that is still an area to me that is still significant enough in the draft and is falling off with the amount of players that teams really like so quickly, that is a significant gain for the Washington Commanders, who have given up on Howell as the starter because of the number 2 overall pick. The rest of these stories are all very similar, so I'm not going to cover them in detail, but Kenny Pickett to the Philadelphia Eagles, Desmond Ridder to the Arizona Cardinals, Jimmy Garoppolo to the LA Rams, all of these as backups and less significant backups than the Sam Howell trade that we just talked about. So next up, Hollywood Brown on a 1-year deal to Kansas City. This is going to be the same thing for me with the Los Angeles Chargers wide receivers. In a vacuum, Hollywood Brown's value just got a lot higher. He became a lot more interesting. If you were setting his over-under, I think there's a fair reason to set his over-under for yards and touchdowns a lot higher than it was yesterday. But from a market perspective, given the hype and the connection that's going to be there with the Tyreek Hill comparisons that are naturally going to come with how Tyreek Hill was featured in this offense before, I think Hollywood Brown is becoming a big-time sell. I'll talk about him a little bit more, probably a little bit more in the next show where I'm focusing a little bit more on values, but I've seen a lot of theoretical trades with Hollywood Brown and Calvin Ridley where most people seem to be siding with Hollywood Brown. And to me, that is not something that I would be doing right now. So if I could sell Hollywood Brown based on this for Calvin Ridley, maybe something a little bit extra, that is a move that I would absolutely be targeting. Next up, Curtis Samuel, 3-year, $30 million contract to Buffalo, $15 million guaranteed. The biggest thing for this, for the market perspective, maybe if you have Curtis Samuel, if you like Curtis Samuel, I think this is a very good thing for him because it's both a solid contract and a team with solid upside capability. But Curtis Samuel is obviously a player that most people see as having limited upside, and for fair reason. He hasn't really had the big seasons before, and he hasn't been consistent very often either, so Curtis Samuel's not a player that I'm super excited about despite the 15 guaranteed. The biggest reaction to this is if you're someone who was having some kind of faith in Khalil Shakir, if you really believe that Khalil Shakir post Gabe Davis would potentially be the guy, that's clearly not the direction that the Buffalo Bills are going in. And I would be pretty scared about this one if I were holding on to Khalil Shakir. Now, it has been proven in the past on this show that some mistakes that I make is because I have my own, limited to some, I try not to make it limited, but I have my own limited vision of how I see players fitting in. But I guess what I'm getting at is Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir are players that to me would fit a similar vision of what I'm expecting players to do on a football field in terms of roles. And so having Curtis Samuel being the more experienced, more productive, and higher paid one of the two definitely makes Khalil Shakir a player that I'd be very nervous about that fact. Next up, there's not really much to make of this one until we actually see where he goes, but it is worth noting that Michael Gallup was released by the Dallas Cowboys. So Dallas, despite the narrative of going all in, that a lot of their fans have been upset given the transactions, Dallas is at a place where outside of Dak and CD, they really don't have that much. I wouldn't really call Dak and CD winners because it's frankly just impossible for me to believe that this is what the Dallas Cowboys offense is going to look like in a few months. I mean, obviously, it's going to look something like this, but it's just between the running back room, between the wide receiver room, behind CeeDee Lamb, behind some of the guys they lost on the offensive line, it's just really hard to know exactly what this offense is going to look like outside of the big two names. And then last news item, the Vikings trade up from the 40s to pick 23 with Houston, and this is a big deal subtly for a couple reasons here. Number one, the chances that the Vikings are doing this to, say, secure a player they really like at pick 23 is highly unlikely. This is a preparation to have more assets than anybody else on the table to get the quarterback that they want. And if you're asking me in the moment too, and this doesn't really matter that much, but the quarterback they want is Drake May at number 3. Now, to be fair, I can't even be confident that Drake May is going to be there at number 3, but if you're asking for my instant reaction, some will call it an instant overreaction to this trade. The top 3 picks of this NFL draft are going to be Caleb Williams at number 1 to the Bears, Jaden Daniels at number 2 to the Washington Commanders, and Drake May at number 3 to the Minnesota Vikings. As someone who has Drake May in a Devy league, but also as a Bears fan, I have very many mixed emotions about the pairing with Kevin O'Connell and Justin Jefferson, which I find perfect. But again, I've already gotten into that way too much. The point is, to me, if you were betting on anybody outside of the Bears and the Commanders, including the Patriots, landing a top 4 quarterback at this point, I would bet on the Vikings. Whether it be May, whether it be Daniels, or whether it be J.J. McCarthy, I think that they're going to be the team that secures a top 4 quarterback. And then on the other side of things, now it might be a little too early to say this. A lot of rumors about potential Brandon Ayuk trades. Mike Williams still out there. But it really seems like the trade away of the first round pick was another sign that the Texans are not going to make major changes to the wide receiver room, which means that managers who have Nico Collins and Tank Dell can rejoice in the idea that these 2 players might be able to dominate the target share moving forward, at least for the next year, for the Houston Texans, provided that Tank Dell's recovery is continuously on schedule. And then this is probably a bout of bad hosting, but I wasn't really talking about the NFL news items, the really minor ones throughout the prospect shows that weren't really talking about the NFL as much. And I even said that I would cover them when I got to the free agency, and all the things that happened before free agency, which wasn't a lot, or really kind of a couple ones I want to talk about, I kind of forgot to, mention it all or remember that I needed to mention. So these are very old or more old news items, but I figured I'd just throw them in here as well. Tyler Lockett restructured his deal with the Seattle Seahawks, which I'm not going to make a big deal about this for the Jackson Smith-Njigba thing, but I do think it's worth noting that Tyler Lockett leaving the team soon was something I think a lot of people who got and bought into JSN were really hoping was going to happen. So it doesn't look like that's going to happen, at least for the second year of JSN's career as well. And then the other major one I wanted to talk about, Jerry Jeudy going to the Cleveland Browns for, I believe it was a 5th and 6th round pick. I don't really know if there's a big change to anybody, because if it was a big investment, I would say it was bad for Moore. But considering that Elijah Moore's value is so far down already, and that Jerry Jeudy only got brought in for a 5th and a 6th, I could easily see Elijah Moore's role really even not changing if you were to say believe that he was the better receiver of the two. I think the ideal spin that you can make of this is that the ideal version of Jerry Jeudy looks at least similar to Amari Cooper. So you hope that he can maybe, learn in the footsteps of Amari Cooper as Amari Cooper ages into his early 30s seasons. But Jerry Jeudy is a player that, given the investment and the overall disappointment, he's one of the players I'm most disappointed in myself in probably my whole life of playing Dynasty Fantasy Football of not selling, because I had so many opportunities myself to trade away Jerry Jeudy, and I just never did it at the right time, including to at least one person who listens to this show. And it's just the fact of the matter that at this point in his career, do I still have faith that Jerry Jeudy maybe could be something? Could, definitely, maybe. But it's not something that I would be willing to bet on. So if anybody really loved this landing spot, I would sell. But it is worth noting that Jerry Jeudy was traded to the Cleveland Browns. And the big beneficiary or potential beneficiary of that, and it's the one that most people have talked about, is Marvin Mims. You got to hope that Marvin Mims can take advantage of this situation. So speaking of taking advantage of their situations, I'm going to transition into talking about some more broad topics instead of these raw reactions that the last podcast was and the earlier portion of this show was. We're going to get into some more broad picture winners, different categories of winners, winners who stayed, winners who changed locations, winners who might not be winners for very long. I am naming all these kinds of winners because I do think there should be more winners when you're dealing with the offseason. People should win in the offseason. No one's getting hurt in the offseason. Everything's in theory. You should be winning in theory, and so that's why I have so many winners, but I do have losers as well. It's also important to note that on this show, I do a lot of talking about general values in terms of, say, an improved situation, and I do probably more talking about market values, and the market values are the more important things. However, despite the fact that the market values are the more important things, they also take the longer time to develop and to know how to react to them, because we need to see how the market reacts to all of these moves. So because of that, I'm kind of breaking up my winners and losers between these two shows. This show is about winners and losers in the general sense, whose situation improved, whose situation got worse. Next show is going to focus a lot more on my targets based on how the market is reacting to all of these things. So the number one biggest name on the winners list for me is the new Baltimore Raven, Derrick Henry. Now, Derrick Henry is obviously very old at this stage for a running back. Derrick Henry will turn almost 31 by the end of the season. He has over 2,000 career carries. That said, the number one thing that makes this the perfect fit, the ideal fit, the winner situation for Derrick Henry is that this is the situation with the Baltimore Ravens that can really mask his decline if he is having one. If he's not having one, he'll be incredible and be a really effective and efficient back for this team. If he does have a decline, this is the kind of team that can manage it better than most. Now, to be fair, they've said that with a number of running backs recently, but those running backs haven't had as recently the seasons that Derrick Henry had, and many of them had never had the seasons that Derrick Henry had, especially like when it comes to the actual quality of play. No disrespect to a lot of the guys that the Baltimore Ravens brought in over the last few years. Some of them had really good years as fantasy contributors, but none of them were Derrick Henry. Another major running back winner is DeAndre Swift, the new running back for the Chicago Bears. DeAndre Swift's contract looked the same as many of the others that came out, but it's important to note that next to Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift had the highest total guarantee, higher than even Josh Jacobs and his 4-year, $48 million contract. So with that in mind, DeAndre Swift is somebody who, if you held on to DeAndre Swift for a really long time, you got really excited by the move to the Eagles. He did a very nice job last year, and this contract probably solidifies his value for the next few years. Up next, I have Gus Edwards reuniting with Greg Roman, and I'll talk about the wide receivers that I mentioned a little bit later or in a slightly different category. But I think it's important to note that all the things I said about Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh play into Gus Edwards being a winner here. Even if the Chargers bring in a running back at, say, pick 69, a player who would automatically have significantly more fantasy value than Gus Edwards still has a chance to be a very viable player here as a running back too in a Greg Roman system. He's done that most of his career. Now, what I will say is Gus Edwards to me is a major sell off this. For the most part, obviously, in certain situations, you might just need a running back as a contender, and I think there's at least a reasonable chance he has a good year. But I think there's something that happens where when players are on the fringe, we look at certain things less often because we already consider them on the fringe. And it's important to note that Gus Edwards is becoming a very old running back at this point. Again, just talking about in running back years, but Gus Edwards will be closer to 29 and a half when the season starts, and he will be turning 30 not too long after the season ends. So Gus Edwards will be turning 30 in this 2-year contract that he's just signed with the Los Angeles Chargers. And so I really sometimes don't think we talk about fall-offs when players are already on the fringe, but I would argue that fall-offs are almost more important when players are on the fringe, because if Gus Edwards loses a little bit, that could be a bigger problem than Derrick Henry losing a little bit. I mean, Gus Edwards has less than Derrick Henry to begin with. So based on the age and the fact that he's going to be reunited with Greg Roman, which will, considerably make his floor appear higher, that probably makes Gus Edwards a sell for me. But again, this section is about winners, and Gus Edwards is a winner because of the situation that improved for him. I also thought about putting Devin Singletary in the section of winners that could lose value due to the draft, but the Giants really did pay Devin Singletary significant money. And so while I do think it's feasible that he could lose value at the draft, I actually think it's less likely than some other people believe. And specifically, they've paid him enough that he probably has a role on their team, a significant role on their team even if they bring in a new running back, because that's just a lot of money to pay a backup running back. And so those are 3 running backs, but those are my 3 winners that changed location right now in Derrick Henry, Gus Edwards, and Devin Singletary. I also have Gabe Davis and Calvin Ridley kind of in this territory. I think you could argue it both ways. Calvin Ridley, I definitely think should be considered a winner just because of the contract he signed. And I really don't mean that on a personal level. I mean that we should take into account how the NFL chooses to value players, even though that's not directly related to how they score points in our game. And it's worth noting that this is a very high evaluation that a lot of teams were fighting over for Calvin Ridley. And then Gabe Davis, not sure if he should be here or in the winners who could potentially lose value in the draft, but I think regardless on if the Jaguars bring someone else in, as long as they don't bring in like a Brandon Ayuk, I think Gabe Davis has a decent chance of being a winner here with a new situation and a decent contract that he should be able to at least be a beneficial piece for this team. So in terms of the winners that did not move locations, and I think I have a few more of these, but the biggest one to me is Will Levis. Will Levis got a very talented running back to help his running game, and he got a very talented pass catcher to bump guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Treylon Burks one step down the ladder. That's a big thing for a quarterback in this NFL game. Are these wide receivers incredible, especially when you consider the age dynamics and the fact that Treylon Burks hasn't really developed as much as people wanted him to? They're definitely not incredible, but I definitely think Will Levis is a big winner of the players who stayed where they are. That said, the biggest winner and the one that most people would consider the headlining big winner of the players who stayed where they are, Drake London, who got Kirk Cousins to be his starting quarterback. So big time winning here for Drake London. Kirk Cousins is not just a small upgrade at quarterback. He's not just another Darnold or Minshew. This is a very, very good quarterback, a guy that we've seen make 2 fantasy wide receivers work very consistently, a guy that we've seen make one guy work at the highest level consistently. The only thing I can really say that would be negative towards this, specifically when I'm not bringing up the market in this situation, is that Kirk Cousins is of a more advanced age at the quarterback position, and he is coming off of an Achilles injury. So if there is any significant fall off in his play, if there is anything to the older school version of quarterbacks kind of hit an age cliff at some point, there is some kind of risk, I think, that Kirk Cousins hits an age cliff. There's at least more risk associated with that with Kirk Cousins coming off an Achilles than there would be with Kirk Cousins if he was 10 years younger. So I'm not super worried about that, but just in the conversation of what makes Drake London a winner, it's worth pointing out. I also have George Pickens as a winner of this free agency period. Deontay Johnson leaving, going to the Carolina Panthers. And they also brought in a quarterback that, in theory, I think a lot of people, myself included, do think there's some merit to the idea that George Pickens is going to be Russell Wilson's favorite, and that there's some meshing there of concept and ideas. Russell Wilson is very willing to throw outside and deep passes and throw to players that are willing to get themselves open at the point of attack. And that is who George Pickens is. And so this is the most George Pickens has ever been with a quarterback like that. And so I do think George Pickens can fairly be called a winner in this free agency cycle. I've already talked about Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Marvin Mims a little bit, Quentin Johnson a little bit, Joshua Palmer a little bit, but it's important to note that all of these guys are in this section as players who stayed where they are and potentially gained value in their circumstance or situation. Again, a couple of these guys like Johnston and Palmer, like Mims in particular, and I also have Christian Kirk in this section. These guys could lose value as well due to the draft, but right now I have them as winners. And going into Christian Kirk, I want to talk about Christian Kirk in just a little bit more detail. I don't want to get into the buy-sell stuff too deep, but since it is kind of important and time sensitive, I wouldn't really be buying Christian Kirk right now because I think there's a decent chance that the Jaguars do add more at the wide receiver position. But I would be looking to buy Christian Kirk still in this offseason, even after the Jaguars bring in another wide receiver. I think Christian Kirk is a winner as of now in this situation, especially because I think Gabe Davis is the kind of guy who, if you like a player, and I'm not trying to shade Gabe Davis when I say this, but if you like a player, Gabe Davis doesn't really scare you too much because what he does is so inconsistent, that you can still believe that your player is going to get the more consistent volume role, which is obviously a big deal here, right? Another player that I do think will have his value take a hit because of a drafted player, but Demario Douglas, the wide receiver of the New England Patriots, is a player that I list as a winner right now, with them not getting Calvin Ridley, and the fact that I think he showed some interesting things as a rookie. And then one final winner I have as Bryce Young. Now, you can obviously have assumed that the Carolina Panthers were going to do basically anything they could to put a team around Bryce Young that they could at least feel was giving a fair evaluation in year 2 for Bryce Young, but it's different from saying it and doing it, and they did 2 specific things with bringing in Diontae Johnson at a low cost, and then also trading Brian Burns for the 39th overall pick, which made it easier for them to target an early second round wide receiver, or even move up if they wanted to do that into the first round and target a wide receiver of their choice. Those are now options for the Carolina Panthers. Now, to be clear, I don't think they should trade up because of how much draft capital they've already spent and given up, but it's just worth noting that they have more options to help build around Bryce Young. And then a couple more of these players who are winners potentially at this point, but I think could potentially be quick to lose value if a player comes in. Again, some of these players I've already talked about fit under this criteria too, but these ones are a little bit more specific, starting with who kind of I just talked about, Diontae Johnson. Diontae Johnson, as of right now, I could see as a potential winner because even though I don't think Carolina Panthers are a great landing spot, I don't necessarily believe Diontae Johnson was being well situated for volume in Pittsburgh as things stood at the time. And so I do think there's a chance that Diontae Johnson, if Diontae Johnson was the only guy in Carolina, I would consider this a winning move because the floor volume would be so high in my opinion. But with the questions around Bryce Young and the fact that I do think they're going to bring in at least one rookie that they like a bit, maybe even 2 rookies that they like a bit, I do think there's a good chance that after the draft, it doesn't feel like Diontae Johnson is a winner as someone who's competing with some very talented guys for targets from Bryce Young. I also listed Rashid Shaheed and A.T. Perry because right now in New Orleans, outside of Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara, and they did bring in Cedric Wilson, there's not that much there. So it's worth noting that these 2 players do have a pretty substantial opportunity right now, but I do feel like the Saints are also a team that could potentially bring in a player at a slightly higher investment than either of these 2 players. And for the record, I do like Shaheed a little bit more than Perry. I have Rachaad White and Zamir White as 2 players that I'm listing here. I'm really only probably saying them together because they have the same last name, but it's important to note that I have a lot more faith in Rachaad White keeping his job than Zamir White, though to be fair, I think both are at least viable. I think the situation that the Raiders are in, I think a lot of people are really extreme one way or the another in Zamir White. They either have Zamir White especially, and they really want him to be a long-term starting running back. And then I think there's people who are also annoyed by those people, and their reactions are too extreme, and they think it's like impossible that he could be the starter for the Raiders, despite the fact that when you look at the situation that the Raiders are, they're in the situation of what a lot of teams are in when they decide to kind of go into the year with a Dameon Pierce as the sole running back or something of this nature. So I do think it's at least possible that Zamir White is the Raiders' starting running back right now. But the point is, Rachaad White, Zamir White, big-time winners right now because of who their teams brought in or got rid of, but not necessarily as confident in these 2 guys being winners after the draft as some of the other winners on this list. Kind of in a similar vein, but I also have Chase Brown and Zach Moss here, and kind of in the exact opposite way of the Raiders. It's hard for me to imagine that the Bengals go into the season with this backfield, not because they're so bad, obviously, but because they're so good. And this backfield is fine. There's 2 solid-ish players. I say solid-ish because they haven't. Chase Brown, maybe he can be quite a bit better than that, but we haven't actually seen it at that level yet. But they're very good players. They're just not necessarily the upside options that you settle on when you're a contender. I'm not necessarily saying that it is going to become a priority for the Bengals in the draft, but it's worth noting that even a day 3 guy with these 2 guys and with Zach Moss being a fairly low investment could be a disruptor if it's the right day 3 guy. If there's a day 3 guy that I really like going to the Cincinnati Bengals, that's going to be a player I'm very interested in, at least compared to most day 3 picks. And obviously somebody on this list and multiple players on this list probably are going to be replaced, but as of right now, you got to think at least Sam Darnold, Gardner Minshew, Jacoby Brissett. One of these players is going to be a starting quarterback for a full year. At least they have a chance of being a starting quarterback for a full year. And that's a winning situation, because when you look at some of the younger quarterbacks that could have also gone into those situations that are in backup roles instead, like Sam Howell, like Kenny Pickett, like Desmond Ridder, that's a potential big gain for some of those older French quarterbacks if you have them and are looking for a depth starter in any of your leagues. And so that concludes the winners. And I'm going to talk about a few losers or players with falling value in this free agency cycle. So going into Justin Fields first. Now, obviously, I've covered Justin Fields quite a bit in the last few episodes, but it's very apparent at this point that Justin Fields' value today is much lower than it was 2 weeks ago. Next up, I put non-Will Levis Titans. Now, I'm talking about the Titans that were on the team, so I'm not talking about Calvin Ridley here as well, but I don't think spending up top dollar at wide receiver is good for DeAndre Hopkins. I don't think it's good for Treylon Burks, and I don't think spending up top dollar at running back is good for Tyjae Spears, obviously, and I don't necessarily adding on Tony Pollard. I don't know if this is necessarily a great situation for Tony Pollard, particularly for a guy who got a contract, because I do think Spears is a very dangerous running back for Tony Pollard, who does a lot of the same things that Tony Pollard does. So I would be favoring Tony Pollard between the two, but I do think that they're both similarly talented players, and it would not surprise me if Tyjae Spears was the better running back, certainly. On top of that, more running backs here. Brian Robinson, he had a lot of good press. I still believe a lot of the good press. So I'm especially not selling Brian Robinson low. I talked on the last show about how I'm not afraid of selling players low. Brian Robinson is not a player that I am selling low. He got a lot of good press with the Washington Commanders. He does different things than Austin Eckler, and the deal that they got for Austin Eckler was very solid. At the same time, when it's coming to these things, it's very hard to bring in Austin Eckler and not call a player the loser that's in the backfield with him in terms of the volume you're projecting for that player. So in terms of the projected volume, in terms of the loss of that projected volume, you have to list Brian Robinson as a loser. And then in a similar way, Khalil Herbert, Roschon Johnson, these guys, this is a reminder on day 3 running backs. These are guys who the team has seemed to like, the Chicago Bears. These are guys that have performed at least solid. These are guys that people had a lot of faith in. But when push came to shove and the Bears felt that they had an opportunity to bring in a guy that they actually liked, when they paid DeAndre Swift the guaranteed money, that bumped Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson down value lists quite a bit. So Khalil Herbert, Roschon Johnson, losers here. And then I'm kind of potentially changing my tune on this, because if they get Drake May, it would change my tune on this. But I have Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson here as well, dealing with a rookie, dealing with Sam Darnold. Again, if the rookie's Drake May, I'd feel a little bit different about it. But specifically, if they have J.J. McCarthy, who I think could have some low volume concerns, especially right away, some learning curve concerns, or Sam Darnold, who's just not the highest level quarterback in general, I don't think that's very good for the value of Jordan Addison or TJ Hawkinson. And so that's all I have for the losers. That's all I have for the winners and losers. And that's all I have for this portion of the segment. I didn't obviously stick to the market, because buys and sells are timely things. Sometimes these things have to be done in a certain manner of time, and you could lose your opportunity or window if somebody else takes people up on these opportunities. So that's all I have for that. And I'll take a short break before getting into a prospect profile with Troy's Kamani Vidal, the running back. One brief second before I get back into the show, if anybody has not followed the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify or whatever podcast app you've used to find this show, including the Substack app, I would encourage you to do so. It means a lot to the show. It does encourage the growth of the show, and it is a free way to support the show. So it means a lot to me. Thank you very much, and I will get back into it. While most of the show recently has been overtaken with free agency, I do want to touch on some players here and there that perhaps I haven't covered yet for some reason. Perhaps there's a change. Perhaps it's like a Ray Davis situation where it's a particularly controversial player, a ranking for myself. And today I'm going to talk about a player that I've only mentioned in passing, the Troy running back, Kamani Vidal. So we are post-combine now, which means we have a ton of data and information objectively on these players. Kamani Vidal is 5'7", 7/8 inch, 213 pounds, 4.46 40 time, 83rd percentile vertical jump, 60th percentile broad jump. He also did 18 bench press reps, which is 38th percentile. I also usually don't bring that up, but in combination with the weight at 213 pounds, these two things are going to come up very shortly here to make a point with something else. So the big thing to point out right away with Kamani Vidal is that this is an ultra productive running back. He had over 1,600 yards the last year that he was in college. He also had a fairly active receiving profile with almost 100 receptions over his career. He didn't have any one individual season that you could really point to and say like, wow, that's a dominant receiving year, but he accumulated almost 100 receptions over the course of 4 years. The downside is that he did play in the Sun Belt, and the Sun Belt is what I mean, if we're getting really technical about it, I think the Sun Belt is what I would consider to be the 7th best conference in college football, behind the Power 5 and the American. I would put it above the Mountain West, I'd put it above the MAC, I'd put it above Conference USA. It's not the worst conference in college football, but it is the 7th. So just to put that onto estimations, there's obviously teams that are up and down everywhere, but if you were putting it in kind of a mean or an average perspective, this would be about between the 80th and 95th, say, teams in college football are the level of teams that are playing in this conference. So that's obviously a bit of an issue there in how to read the profile, specifically because being a workhorse is a big part of how you project Kamani Vidal moving forward. Kamani Vidal is a player who measures in at over 213 pounds, and so on that basis, you could look at him as an every down back. But I think that's when we're going to start to pivot and get into some of the more, the things that we try to do on this show, which is to get into both why players can succeed and also why they might not succeed as much. And Kamani Vidal is a player that, despite the workload, I do very clearly see him as a change of pace back. And what I'm getting into with this weight stuff is that this is a very subjective thing. And when I look at a lot of the objective things that I usually look into to determine some of these things, they really don't agree with me. He weighs in at 213 pounds, and the 38th percentile bench press suggests that he should have a decent amount of power. To my eye, he significantly lacks the ability to generate power, and I have a concern there. On top of that, objectively, according to PFF, he has a great number of missed forced tackles. But again, subjectively, to my own eye, I don't really see, again, the power as much. And I think that's where it's really getting into, I think, why this discrepancy is happening between what I'm seeing and what PFF numbers are, is that I talk about balance and burst a lot as my major two running back traits. But balance and burst don't really directly account for power and long speed. And power and long speed are both individually very important as well, and they're kind of related to balance and burst, but they're not specifically directly related to balance and burst. And I think, to me, they're the most important when you're either at the highest level or at the lowest level. And I'm a little concerned that when it comes to balance, Kamani Vidal is really there. But when it comes to power, despite the weight, despite the bench press, I don't see the power from Kamani Vidal. I've also mentioned this on previous shows, but I like to utilize Lance Zierlein's strengths and weaknesses sometimes when analyzing prospects. I don't necessarily like to use the overall grades for fantasy, but I do think that when I'm watching something and I'm not exactly sure if what I'm seeing is what I'm seeing, I like to see if the strengths and weaknesses page has corroborating information. And sometimes it even says something that I'm trying to put words into that I'm not quite doing a great job at, and puts them in a better way, frankly. And Lance Zierlein, or I believe Lance Zierlein, in the weaknesses on NFL.com writes, fails to create much forward momentum when hitting the holes. And so that's, I think, what I'm trying to say ultimately with the Vidal thing. I do think he breaks tackles in general at times. I think he can keep his feet moving. I think he can stay upright. But he doesn't necessarily push people. He doesn't necessarily, like when he runs into tacklers, it seems like he gets stopped, like really stopped, like the momentum gets stopped. And so for that reason, that's kind of why I don't mean it as a dirty dirty term, but when you look at him, Ray Davis, and Blake Corum on paper, these guys don't really look that different. But to me, Blake Corum and Ray Davis, I would project these guys at almost different positions, really. Like, I mean, if I was really breaking it down on like an NFL team, I would probably be ranking running backs differently by what position or role I ultimately felt like they would run at the next level. And Ray Davis and Blake Corum would be closer to 3-down guys or early down guys, or elusive backs that could be early down guys. Whereas to me, Kamani Vidal is your change of pace back. I don't think Kamani Vidal is an interior rusher, and I'm just not sure that Kamani Vidal does some of the other things that those guys do quite as well either. That said, I do think when you're evaluating him as a change of pace back, there are a lot of good things, because being a change of pace back, that's not a dirty word. There's nothing super terrible about it. I mean, you're not going to get 300 touches, and that's ultimately what we want for anybody, but you can definitely still have value even if that projection ends up taking place. It's important to note first and foremost that one of the big things in terms of just projecting someone to be able to become a change of pace back at the NFL level is the ability to pass protect, and he actually has specifically high praise as a pass protector from his coaching staff as one of the best pass protecting running backs, maybe the best pass protecting running back they've ever worked with. And then I mentioned this up front, while he has no individually great season, almost 100 receptions over the course of 4 years is very solid. He has very quick feet. I've been watching a lot of wide receiver converted into running backs recently, and so I don't know if that's the reason, but you can really tell that he has some really nice quick feet, and you can see that also in his long speed, which is not elite, but is very solid, and you see that in the 4.45 or the around mid 4.4s 40 time that he ran. So he has good contact balance. I do think he can break those NFL tackles, but I also do think that the role for him might be just a little bit limited. And then one last quick negative. This one was also echoed, at least to an extent, in Zierlein in terms of the way he sets up tacklers. But when he gets a full head of steam downhill, he turns into a very, almost like a power big linear running back that doesn't really try to make people miss sometimes at the second level and just lowers his head and goes right into him, which, again, given what we just talked about with the power not being ideal for this player, that's not really a tendency that you want to see for this archetype of running back. You want to see a guy, as he progresses downfield at high speeds, is trying to set up tacklers in a way that creates different angles, that manipulates angles, and that gets beyond them. These are things that, at least in my opinion, guys like Devon Achane and Kenneth Walker showed to be extremely good at the college level. I don't think Kamani Vidal does this too much. I think sometimes Kamani Vidal just kind of sees a guy coming at him and decides to go at him, which is, it can work for certain types of running backs. I really don't think that's going to work for Kamani Vidal at the NFL level. So the bottom line here is, zooming out, there are 6 running backs in this class that I say like a good amount. And even those 6 I'm not super high on. But outside of that 6, it is a very wide open marketplace. There was nothing I saw about Kamani Vidal that convinced me that he was close to that 6. But outside of that 6, I think if you're looking at it, you might be looking at it by roles. And if you're looking at it by roles, next to maybe Bucky Irving and Dylan Laube, these guys might not project well for high volume roles, but these would be maybe my next 3 guys in a change of pace or in a pass catching back sense. So I'm not saying necessarily that my 7, 8, and 9 would be Bucky Irving, Kamani Vidal, and Dylan Laube, but I think these 3 change of pace type backs would be kind of my top 3 change of pace backs outside of the top 6. In kind of a similar notion, Kamani Vidal is a player that I wouldn't mind getting as an NFL fan to my team, as someone who could help peripherally as the change of pace back, who is a very good pass protecting running back. So a player, Kamani Vidal, who I got a little bit higher on watching him, looking over the data, but I didn't come away. I was hoping, like I always hope when I watch these players, I was hoping to come away thinking to myself, okay, this is a new guy that I can get really excited about, push into my top 5, my top 6, even say clearly things like maybe he's the clear top 7 running back, despite situation and role. But that's not really what I came away with Kamani Vidal. I did come away with thinking, though, that this is a very, very solid player with a chance to carve out a role at the next level, specifically as a change of pace back. And so that's all I have for Kamani Vidal. I'll take a short break and then some ending notes. And so that's all I have for the show today. The only really thing that I marked on my notes that really needed to be talked about after listening through the show is the fact that I wanted to make sure that the Brandon Aiyuk trade rumors were not attached to Houston because, I try to be on top of information and I don't want to suggest rumors that I'm not trying to suggest. I also mentioned that at the top, and of course Brandon Aiyuk could go there or anywhere, or stay in San Francisco for that matter. The main thing is that there's some trade rumors attached to Brandon Aiyuk. My main point with bringing him up with any wide receiver room is just the fact that he is a massive disruptor to the potential target share in any wide receiver room. And then I think because so much stuff is covered by the Combine page this much, I kind of forgot to bring up Kamani Vidal's just age, which, age isn't the biggest deal. You're talking to a guy who has Ray Davis in his top 5 running backs. But I always like to bring up age when we're talking about these conversations because age is, just a factor and an objective thing that we can weigh and look into a prospect profile. So if you haven't listened to the show for long, all of my age numbers are rounded to September 1st of the current year or of the prospect's declaration year, depending on what we're talking about. Kamani Vidal's age is 23 years as of September 1st. Again, that's not rounded to the nearest year. That's 23 years, 0 months as of September 1st this year, round to the nearest month. So Kamani Vidal, a little bit older for a running back prospect, not too old, not Ray Davis old, but still on the older side of running back prospects. So that's all I have for the show today. Like I said, the goal for next show is to talk about the free agency period with a bit more of a mind on the market. These are the more important takeaways, the players that I'm looking in my fantasy leagues and saying, who can I buy and who can I sell right now that are going to give me benefit in the long term? That is going to be the focus of the show for Thursday morning. Aside from that, I'm also going to profile the Purdue running back Tyrone Tracy, similar to the Kamani Vidal profile this week. It's going to be at the end of the show. But until next time, that is all I have for the show this week, and goodbye.